Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled, My Product is on the Market, Now What? I'm Courtney Young, an attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Kyle Cummins, thank you for joining us. Kyle is an attorney at Butler Snow Law Firm in Memphis, Tennessee. He has experience in product liability and drug and device litigation. Kyle graduated summa cum laude from both law school at the University of Memphis and undergrad at Auburn. Prior to joining Butler Snow, he clerked for the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Tennessee. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Kyle, who will begin today's presentation.
Well, thank you, Courtney, and thanks to Medmarc for having me. I'm pleased to be able to present. Let me just briefly give a little more background so it doesn't seem like you're staring at a PowerPoint on your screen and hearing a modestly Southern accent talk to you about product liability. As Courtney said, I work in the Memphis office of Butler Snow. We have about 350 attorneys, and a lot of us focus our practice on medical device and pharmaceutical product liability. So some of us spend about 100% of our time doing that, and that's what I do. Sometimes that is one-off cases with one plaintiff against one manufacturer, and more often it is many plaintiffs against a single manufacturer about a product claiming all kinds of product liability. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's where I want to start. So here's kind of an overview of where we're going today. I just want to talk about some of the things that we need to be considering about our products that are already on the market. So often we think in my world and in the manufacturing world about bringing products to market and the regulatory requirements. But today I want to just give you some considerations after sale to help us prevent and defend against product liability lawsuits. And specifically, I want to focus today on design defect claims. And part of this is that, technology changes and better designs for medical device products, they usually always become possible as time goes on. And that's all happening while your product is on the market. So within design claims, I'm just going to kind of explain the basics of what a design defect claim is. We're going to talk a little bit about safer alternative designs, which is one of the factors that courts use and juries use in determining whether your product is defective in design. The second thing we're going to talk about is subsequent remedial measures. This is a doctrine of evidence in all areas of law, but it's specifically important to design defect claims, and it hopefully presents some protection for manufacturers when they actually do improve the product, and hopefully prevents them from being sued or from evidence being introduced at trial that the later product should have been available at a prior time. I'll touch briefly on the duty to warn of design improvements. I have a question mark there because it's kind of a novel idea, but a thing that people have been talking about in the legal field. And I'll give some example cases just to kind of bring these concepts home. From the duty to warn of design improvements, I'll take you to just very briefly failure to warn claims, which I know one of my colleagues has presented on, and that presentation is also available on Medmarc's website. So that's a shameless plug for that as well. And under failure to warn, we're going to talk about the idea that medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical manufacturers don't really have the same duty to stay informed about their product as general products. The duty is truly heightened with medical device products, and so that obviously has implications on what we need to do to try to prevent those claims. And then lastly, I'll focus on kind of the idea of post-sale duties to warn. And just as a brief overview, what we're trying to do here is understand these claims and how they're brought by plaintiff's counsel. Because if we can understand how they're brought and what these cases look like at trial and when they're brought, we can hopefully come up with some solutions to prevent and helpfully defend these cases when they're brought. So I'll move to the next slide. And so like I said. And while it may seem like you've done your your diligence after you've designed the product and gotten it cleared or approved, the duty doesn't stop there. As I said, since technology continues forward, we want to have some guidelines to assess whether the design of my product remains reasonable or whether it's subject to some litigation challenges. And so let me take you inside a little bit of what a lawsuit based on the design of a product looks like. So what is a design defect claim? It's a product liability theory, which many of you probably understand, but generally in product liability we have three different categories of defects that the plaintiff will allege. Design defects, manufacturing defects, and warning defects. And those are obviously in chronological order. We design the product, we manufacture the product, and because no medical device is 100% safe or 100% effective, we warn about the risks of the product. And so a design claim is exactly what it says. The plaintiffs are claiming that some facet of the design of the product makes it unreasonably dangerous, and that design defect caused the plaintiff to experience injury. So we have to distinguish it from manufacturing defect and failure to warn. Failure to warn is easy to distinguish. While these claims are often brought in the same lawsuit, a failure to warn says that even if your product, I apologize, may not have moved the slide, says that even if your product is properly designed, you didn't warn of a certain risk. Then the second one is manufacturing defect. This is a little bit different. A manufacturing defect claim says essentially that the product deviated from the design specifications. So even if your design is okay, somehow the product came off of the manufacturing line in somewhat of a substandard condition, and that manufacturing defect caused the plaintiff's injury. Design claims, what we're talking about today, are much more fundamental. They're essentially an assault on the product itself. They argue that something inherent in the design of the product is faulty. In other words, it could have been and should have been better. And if it were better, the plaintiff would not have experienced injury. So once we kind of understand that, I think my first reaction is, well, that's not fair. There are always different ways to design products, and all patients are different, and all products carry different risks. And the law does supposedly support that proposition. There's many quotations in many cases about how there is simply no possible way to design a product to avoid every conceivable risk. So that's important. We have that as a backstop, that we cannot avoid every conceivable risk. But what we do have to talk about is how to prevent and defend against design defect claims. So here you see some factors that courts will consider with defect claims, or with design defect claims. The first is what we're going to spend the most time on: availability and feasibility of alternative designs at the time of manufacture. This is what we call a reasonable alternative design test, and it's in some states it is the standard, and in other states it is a factor that should be considered when we're assessing whether the design of the product is defective. The other factors are really, I guess the second one is conformance to design standards. This is always going to be important, but it's seeming to take a smaller and smaller role in cases that even though you've conformed to design standards that are common at the time for similar products, that's not always going to be dispositive that your product may not be determined to be defective. So the last thing I've written there is the risk utility. And this is a test that most courts will use, and sometimes it includes the alternative design test. But generally here we're comparing, like it says, the risks of the product with the utility of the product. So for utility with medical devices, obviously we hope that if we've gotten a device cleared or approved, that the product carries obviously some great benefit to people, and because it's in the medical field, we hope that it does. But that also feeds into the second factor, the likelihood to cause injury. So with general products, we may be talking about non-serious injuries. Quite often in medical device cases, when we're talking about implantables, or other products, we're thinking of injuries that can be pretty severe. That we're also going to consider the likelihood that the facet in design would cause that injury, and we're going to think about the ability to eliminate the unsafe character of the device. So that kind of feeds into whether the design that the plaintiffs are promoting is a reasonable alternative design. Let's move on. So here I just want to present two standards that have been kind of promulgated in the legal world, and these both come from what lawyers call the third restatement, which is essentially an attempt to take all states' laws and say, this is generally what the law is with regard to this subject. And I've put up the first bullet point, and again, these are the standards for design defect, what courts and juries are going to consider. The first bullet point kind of shows you what, to my knowledge, almost no state has adopted. So this third restatement actually included an entirely separate section for product liability with respect to prescription drugs and medical devices, and that's what that section 6 is. So this is not really the standard anywhere, but it would surely eliminate a lot of claims. And I've paraphrased it here. It's that a product is not defective in design unless the risks of harm are so great that no reasonable healthcare provider possessing knowledge of those risks would prescribe the drug to any class of patients. Now, you can see that that's a pretty stringent standard. And the reason that the drafters of this restatement recognize this is because there is a unique nature to medical devices and prescription drugs. For a long time, courts didn't even impose liability on manufacturers for design defects in medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Instead, they would impose liability because you failed to warn about a risk that was inherent with the product. But that kind of began to change over time, and companies, even pharmaceutical and device manufacturers, began to be held liable for failures in the design of their product. The restatement even says that in the comments, it recognizes these devices are obviously subject to intense regulatory review, and therefore that should be taken into account. And so that's why we have this stringent standard of the healthcare provider would not prescribe it to any class of patients. But as I said, unfortunately, we can't rely on this stringent standard, and most states are going to apply some variation of a risk utility test, which is the second bullet point. That's section 2 of the restatement, and this is really important because this will kind of feed the rest of our time. So I'll just read it very quickly. A product is defective in design when the foreseeable risks of harm posed by the product could have been reduced or avoided by the adoption of a reasonable alternative design, and the omissions of the alternative design renders the product not reasonably safe. So that's taking into account the concept of a reasonable alternative design. In many states, that's going to be a requirement of the plaintiffs to prove that there was a reasonable alternative design, and in some states, it's just going to be a factor that they're going to put before the jury some evidence of that. So let's talk about what kind of considerations we're taking into account when we're talking about a safer alternative design. And I'll refer to it as both a reasonable alternative design and a safer alternative design. Courts refer to it in different ways. So the first way that a plaintiff can kind of bring this claim against a manufacturer is it can compare your design to a competitor's design. Now, this includes products that are on the market that are the same or substantially similar to your product. And when I say same or substantially similar, we're hopefully talking about a product that's not for a completely different purpose. We are talking about a product that has potentially the same indication and is just a different way to design the product. And you can imagine that if a plaintiff in a case is comparing your product to another product on the market, the evidence is very concrete, right? They are putting on their case to say essentially one product is better than the other because of a facet of the design. Now, the product doesn't have to be the exact same, obviously, for the plaintiffs to compare it and to say that it's a reasonable alternative design, because what they're really saying is that there is a facet, some portion of that other product's design that should have been incorporated into the design of your product. And in these cases, from the defense perspective, we generally know what the advantages and disadvantages of that other product are, so we can attempt to defend the claim on that basis. The second consideration is whether it was practical to adopt the reasonable alternative design at the time of sale. Here's where industry practice on design is important, because you're saying, essentially, all other manufacturers are designing products in this way, using this material, using this facet of the design, and it's the industry standard, and so it was not practical to adopt a different one at the time of sale. Unfortunately, industry standard is not dispositive on this issue. And so even if your product was the quote-unquote best on the market, even compared to other products, that is not the end-all be-all. That's not the end of the case. And that's because the plaintiffs can establish a reasonable alternative design, quote, notwithstanding that such a design was not adopted by any manufacturer or even considered for commercial use at the time of sale. So you can see that's a pretty wide-ranging standard that a plaintiff can come in and say, here's a better design of the product that would eliminate the risk of the product, and even though no one was using it at the time that the product was sold, it should have been used at the time the product was sold, and everybody knew that it could be adopted as an alternative design. This kind of evidence is always at trial going to have to come from an expert, so the plaintiffs are going to bring in an expert to say that this was the better design and it was possible to adopt this at the time of sale. The third bullet point there is really important defense, and it's something that we can keep in mind a little bit as a protection, and hopefully lessens the impact of what I just talked about, and that is that we can consider the advantages and disadvantages of the proposed alternative design. So the separate design that the plaintiffs are attempting to establish, we can kind of put that hypothetical design on trial, and you can think about some of the questions that we would ask here. Does it have the same advantages as our product? Would it carry some unknown disadvantages? What's the longevity of the product? Here, it's important because it's not sufficient that an alternative design would have prevented the plaintiff's injury if it would have also introduced risks of equal or greater magnitude. So just because a product might have avoided this plaintiff's injury, it doesn't mean that that's a reasonable alternative design if that reasonable alternative design would have had other risks present. And again, that's just kind of a weighing of which product is better and which aspects of the product are better. The last bullet point I have up here is production cost of the alternative design. And obviously, this is another kind of a safeguard and something that defendants can rely on because it is important. Obviously, these things cost money, and to design a product a different way does impact a court's and a jury's consideration. So it's obviously valid, but I'll tell you from a lawyer's perspective that this doesn't play very well at trial. You can imagine the optics of a trial or even motion practice before a trial claiming that a reasonable alternative design was too expensive to manufacture. It's a tough defense to tell a jury and to tell a judge that just because this alternative design costs more money, therefore it shouldn't have been adopted. So kind of in summary on this slide, the requirement of reasonable alternative design, and this is a quote, but it's something that we can kind of take to the bank. It's based on the common sense notion that liability for product design should only attach when the harm is reasonably preventable. So reasonably preventable. Would the alternative design reasonably prevent the injury that we're talking about? So those are the things that the court can consider or the jury can consider. Here's a few things, just two brief points that we shouldn't have to worry about. If a product has completely different advantages and disadvantages, a court is likely to say that it's essentially not a fair comparison, that this is quite simply a different product. We're not going to allow a jury to consider whether a product that is 100% different, treats a different indication, has different risks and benefits, and essentially is not the same product, we're not going to allow that to be compared and say that this company should have adopted that design. And then the second bullet point deals with what can you compare the device at issue with. And generally, alternative surgeries in the place of the implantation of a medical device, I have to provide all caveats that it may be admissible, but normally that's not a valid comparison. It's not a valid, reasonable alternative design to say, well, you should have done a surgery that would have helped the plaintiff rather than implant the medical device, because the medical device hopefully is making the surgery easier, has benefits over that surgery, and essentially we're not comparing the product to the design of anything else, which is the requirement of design defect claims. So just briefly, I want to walk through a case that's really helpful in kind of bringing all of these points home. This is not a landmark decision, but it's just a great explanation of how a design defect case works in practice. And it's not a medical device case, as you can see, the defendant's Ford Motor Company. It was decided in 2011 in Illinois, and it's just really helpful to see how this works in a general products case because the facts are a lot more accessible. So here are the facts of what happened. In 2003, a couple was traveling home in their 1993 Lincoln Town Car in Illinois. It came to a complete stop in a construction zone, and a car slammed into the back of the town car at about 55 or 65 miles per hour. There was no evidence that the brakes were applied by the car behind the town car, and as a result of the crash, what happened was a large pipe wrench in the trunk of that couple's town car. It penetrated the trunk and penetrated the fuel tank, and the car burst into flames. Unfortunately, it caused the death of the husband, and it permanently injured the wife. After the plaintiff settled with the driver of the other car, they pursued claims against Ford, the maker of the Lincoln Town Car that burst into flames. So they claimed that the fuel tank, which was close to the rear of the vehicle, was located in the wrong place. It was too close to the bumper. So you can see that's a criticism of the design of the product, that the fuel tank was located in the wrong place, and that had it been located in another place, it would have averted the plaintiff's injury. So it's helpful to take a look at some of the evidence that the plaintiffs presented in that trial to show that the design was defective. The plaintiffs hired an expert, as they would in basically every case, including all cases with medical devices, and the expert testified that at the time Ford manufactured the Lincoln Town Car, a safer, more practical location for the fuel tank would have been further towards the front of the car. The expert even performed crash tests in 2004, obviously a long time after the car was developed, and he performed those tests on a different car altogether. He performed the test on a 1992 Ford Thunderbird. We're really getting into our cars here. The Thunderbird had a forward of the axle fuel tank, meaning its fuel tank was farther up to the front. And when the expert conducted all of these crash tests, it revealed no punctures in the fuel tank and no indication that components from the trunk went into the fuel tank. And so you can see that this is proof of plaintiff's reasonable alternative design. They've tested it, and they're saying this is how the product should have been designed before. They also presented evidence that by 1991, which was 2 years before the car was sold, the majority of Ford models were already being manufactured with fuel tanks farther towards the front. And they testified that 10 years before that, Ford had started moving the fuel tanks in other models of cars to a position that was farther forward. So I know we're in the weeds, but this is evidence of industry standard. The plaintiffs are using it against the defendants to say other people were doing this at the time, and you should have been doing it at that time as well. But what's important is the court's analysis of these factors and the evidence that was presented. And it touches on the reasonable alternative design factors that we talked about before. Number one, the court said you can't compare different products. So the crash tests were done on a Thunderbird. That's not a town car. So that was different cars for different people. Each have unique risks and benefits, some aesthetically, some safety. And so it wasn't appropriate for the expert to conduct a test on a completely separate car and then draw the line towards the design of this car. The second thing the court considered was the feasibility of the alternative design. It said that moving the fuel tank would have required Ford to completely redesign the vehicle, right? It wasn't a matter of simply moving the fuel tank. Ford would have had to completely redesign the town car, and so that made the design of the car that the plaintiffs were proposing not feasible. The court also considered, as we discussed before, the advantages and disadvantages of the alternative design. So moving the fuel tank forward would have created even more risk. That would have included fuel-fed fires from the front of the car that wouldn't have existed with the design that the company previously had. And the last thing the court looked at was the likelihood of harm, right? This risk that the plaintiff suffered, that the components from the truck penetrated the fuel tank, it wasn't very likely to occur in others. There were millions of these cars that were already on the road, and there had been virtually no accidents like this. So that's likelihood of harm evidence. The plaintiffs even introduced evidence that Ford later supplied a design improvement, a trunk pack, that stopped trunk contents from puncturing the fuel tank. It did that, though, for police forces, people that were using a different car altogether as police cars. The court thought it was important that police cars were at a much higher likelihood of being struck from behind at 55 to 65 miles per hour. So again, they're noting that this hasn't really ever happened outside of this case. So that's kind of how a design defect works in practice. And that's a good example of what you'd see just with different facts in a medical device case. So you might be wondering at this point, why doesn't FDA compliance mean anything? Why could my product be subject to a product liability lawsuit when I've already gotten FDA approval or clearance? And it's a good question. The good news is that for pre-market approval devices, there is a doctrine called preemption, and it applies to some other devices as well. Preemption would take an entirely separate presentation, and so we're not going to touch too much on preemption, but that would essentially say that a plaintiff cannot bring this claim because it is not allowable under the United States Constitution because of the Supremacy Clause and the FDA's regulatory authority. So the restatement, though, that we looked at earlier also tells us that compliance with FDA standards may be relevant at trial. It may be something that we can present to a jury or to a judge to say that we acted reasonably and that we're not subject to liability. So you can see there that the third restatement says a product's compliance with an applicable product safety statute or administrative regulation is properly considered at trial. It's properly considered to determine whether the product was defective. So it seems like that this evidence is relevant. In some recent cases, there's been a discussion about whether FDA compliance is even allowed to be presented to a jury, and I've listed two cases right there. These cases hold, or at least the first holds, that because the 510K clearance, which requires you to show that your product was substantially or equivalent to a prior product, because it doesn't deal with safety, quote-unquote, safety and effectiveness, that FDA compliance is not relevant to a product liability trial. Well, there's a separate case, and these are just two examples, where essentially we have the opposite holding, which is that, of course, 510K, even though it is not as rigorous as a pre-market approval regimen, it still deals with safety and safety and efficacy, and therefore it should be considered by a jury to determine whether a product is defective. So we do have some case law that we can rely on to say our compliance with the FDA does mean something. And I just want to take a quick aside just to talk a little bit about how important compliance with FDA regulations is, even in design defect cases. I know we're talking a lot about litigation rather than compliance, but it's still paramount. So no matter what its relevance at trial, sharing information with the FDA and the medical community is extremely important to the defense of the case. It's especially important in cases where the plaintiffs are alleging punitive damages. Unfortunately, the story that plaintiffs' lawyers like to tell is that a company, and this is a common theme in each medical device and pharmaceutical case, is that the company was hiding evidence, was hiding the ball from the FDA, it was hiding the ball from the medical community, and the reason that it was doing this is because it was putting, quote, profits over patient safety. It's a term that we hear all the time. And so documenting communications with the FDA and the more evidence that we can present to show that actually, no, the company was open and honest about the risks and benefits of the product, the better off we are. And that's in a design case, that's in a failure to warn case, that's in any case. We want to be able to show that the company was being open and honest with the risks and benefits of its product. So the next topic is hopefully a protection against some of these claims, or at least some of the evidence. This doctrine of subsequent remedial measures is an evidentiary standard. And we just heard from that Jablonski case, the Illinois case, that plaintiffs introduced testimony about Ford's later actions. They later moved the fuel tank to a different location, and they provided some sort of trunk pack to help reduce the harm. But there is some protection for technological advances like that, and here we're discussing, as I said, the doctrine of subsequent remedial measures. Subsequent remedial measure is an action taken to make harm less likely to occur. So it's a rule of evidence, and it has a counterpart in virtually every state. And the gist of the rule is that if you make a product safer through design or warning improvement, that evidence is not supposed to be allowed to be used to prove that your product was previously defective. And as you can imagine, the rationale for the rule is policy-based. It rejects the notion that because the world gets wiser as it gets older, therefore it was foolish before. One of my favorite authors calls this chronological snobbery, right? Just because we're doing it different now doesn't mean that it wasn't entirely appropriate before. And the rule attempts to encourage manufacturers of medical devices, manufacturers of all products, to make design improvements, and that evidence should not be allowed at trial. Unfortunately, sometimes in my profession we say that the exceptions to this rule sometimes swallow the rule. These are permissible uses of subsequent remedial measures, so making an improvement to the design of your product. These are some of the permissible uses that plaintiffs can use it. And I realize that these are some legal terms up here, but we just want to focus on the third one, to demonstrate the feasibility of precautionary measures. Since obviously this is especially important in product liability cases, because we just got done talking about how in the requirement of safer alternative design, one of the elements of alternative design is that it be feasible, that it actually be a possibility to manufacture the product like that. So the rule is severely limited in this way for products, because evidence of a subsequent remedial measure can be admitted to show that the separate design was feasible when you sold your first product. So it's essentially using your subsequent design against your first product. Now, in the legal world, we call it a limitation on admissibility. Your subsequent remedial measure is supposed to only be offered to show the jury that it was feasible to create this, not that you were wrong for not doing it. But as you can imagine, the average juror is going to have a hard time with the notion that proof of what could have been done doesn't mean that it's what should have been done. So that distinction can sometimes fall away when you're at trial and when you're defending the case at the motion stages. So there's a quick example there from an older case often cited. Obviously, a airplane case. There was an airplane crash, and the plaintiffs claimed that the event occurred because of a design defect. An alternator in the plane was defective and caused the crash. That was the plaintiff's claim. And after the crash, Boeing made improvements to the alternator that the plaintiffs alleged were previously defective. When the defendants tried to keep that evidence out, the plaintiffs argued that they were simply offering these subsequent improvements as evidence that it would have been feasible to incorporate those improvements in the previous design. And the court allowed it. So you can see how the rule can be severely limited by its exceptions. And many people would say that the exceptions have essentially swallowed the rule. So the rule does have some good implications that may provide some protection. But the gist of my presentation here is that your subsequent remedial measure is not something that you can 100% rely on to prevent plaintiffs from bringing that evidence in the second case. All right, so now we move on just for a very brief discussion of some post-sale considerations in warning claims. As I mentioned, one of my colleagues, Casey Adams, presented on failure to warn claims in detail in February. The webinar is titled, "If You Label It, They Will Come," in a nod to the movie Field of Dreams. So today I'm just going to really briefly touch on some post-sale considerations with failure to warn. So first we have to understand when the duty stops. And in traditional product liability, for just general products, in the past, the duty to warn stopped at the time of sale. So you see it right here in the current restatement. The product is defective when, at the time of sale or distribution, it contained an inadequate instruction or warning. So for traditional products, for a long time, no matter what you learned later, courts couldn't simply impose a continuing duty to warn. And this was based on the fact that for most general products, especially in the past, it's very hard to keep up with, well, how many products do we have on the market? What is our duty to continually monitor that product? And there is a policy decision that you don't have to continue to monitor the product. There's an example there, and again, this is all just general product liability. I'm going to explain to you the difference in in medical device cases in just a moment. But that example case there was a tractor case, and the manufacturer originally manufactured the tractor and designed it without a roll bar, which was designed to prevent injury in the event that the tractor rolled over. And the plaintiff was killed in the tractor when it rolled over in 1988. So that was 25 years actually after the tractor at issue was sold. And of course the company had later made an improvement to the product, and later versions of the tractor had a roll bar. And the court in that case held that Colorado law, that was the law that applied in this case, said that the product was not defective at the time of manufacture. It did not contain an inadequate warning because at the time, that's how all tractors were made. This was 25 years ago. And so it was really the duty stopped at sale. There was no duty. You couldn't hold a manufacturer liable for something that it failed to warn about 25 years ago when that was industry standard and that was a reasonable design. The next development, and we see it again in the restatement third, is a recognition of a post-sale duty to warn for general products. Again, we're still just talking about general products. And it imposed liability for failing to warn after the sale of a product if a reasonable manufacturer would provide such a warning. And I've listed the elements in the restatement there, that a manufacturer know or should know the product possesses a substantial risk of harm, that the people to be warned can be identified and are unaware, that the warning can be effectively communicated to those people, and that the risk of harm is sufficiently great to justify the burden of providing a warning. Now, each of those sound like sometimes tough elements to prove in a general products case, but as we know, in a medical device case, the duty is a bit different. It doesn't necessarily and hasn't traditionally stopped at sale. So here we have a comment from the restatement that tells us that medical devices and pharmaceutical products are different. In cases involving prescription drugs, the courts have imposed a continuous duty to keep abreast of the scientific developments touching upon the manufacturer's product and to notify the medical profession of additional side effects discovered from its use. And so this is extremely important because we know that the duty on manufacturers of medical devices is heightened from traditional products. You do have these FDA compliance standards, and we're not really going to go in detail on that, but the common law also imposes this continuing duty to study and understand your product. So in general products, the burden of constantly monitoring the product in the field is usually too burdensome to support a post-sale duty to warn. But the restatement says that with regard to one class of products, prescription drugs and devices, courts have always imposed a continuing duty to test and to monitor the product afterwards. So these are things that we have to keep in mind when our product is on the market. We have to stay abreast of the medical literature. We have to continually assess our product. And we have to know that just because our product was approved or cleared by the FDA, and just because it's been on the market for a long time, that does not absolve us of the duty to continue to study the product. I've given you an example case there, but I'll just briefly touch on it. In this case, the defendants argued that they were under no duty to warn of a defect that they learned of after sale, and you can see that this is a medical device case. It was a knee implant system, and the company later learned that the knee implant system had a shelf life of 5 years. They didn't know that at the time. It was sold to a hospital in 1991. It was implanted in 2002. The plaintiff had to undergo a revision surgery after that. But as you can see, when it was sold, the product was not technically defective because it had a shelf life of 5 years. It was not defective at the time of sale. And the defendants argued, well, there's no post-sale duty to warn. But with manufacturers of medical products, as we've just described, there's a continuing duty to keep abreast of scientific literature, and the company was required to warn of this latent defect, the defect that they found later. And so that just illustrates that the duties of a medical device manufacturer are simply different than a traditional products manufacturer. The last little brief caveat we have to make is that there is some question in the case law about a duty to warn of design improvements. So we quickly go back to that Jablonski case that we were talking about earlier. The plaintiffs also claimed that Ford should have warned of a design improvement. And that was, as you'll recall, they claimed that not only should they have designed the product with that trunk pack to keep the contents of the trunk from puncturing the fuel tank, but they also alleged that even if they didn't have a duty to design it that way, that they should have warned the plaintiffs and others that they later developed a design improvement to this. The court held in this case that Illinois did not recognize a post-sale duty to warn of design improvements like this. But it's an interesting example because, as we've been talking about, medical device manufacturers have a heightened duty, and so you can see that it might be feasible or questionable whether a court might say, for certain types of products, you do have a post-sale duty to warn of design improvements. Now, I offer that with the caveat that that's a developing body of law and not quite clear on exactly how that's going to turn out. So I'll just conclude with some best practices here. We've been talking a lot about the duties of a medical device manufacturer, whether that's related to its design or its warnings. And we've talked the most about design, so I do want to focus on that here. As I said, we want to continue to assess the risk-benefit profile of our devices that are on the market. We cannot sit back on our hands and wait for plaintiff's counsel to file a lawsuit. We need to be proactive in continually assessing the design of our device and the device's warnings. One way that we can do that is to monitor similar products. We need to know what on the market is like my product. How are those products being designed? Are they using different materials now? What improvements can we make, and can we make them timely? Those obviously impose costs and time and personnel, but these are extremely important factors to consider when we're trying to avoid product liability litigation. And again, documentation of those efforts are extremely valuable in defending product liability lawsuits. The more reasonable that we can show that we are and that we are constantly assessing the safety and efficacy of the device, the better we're going to present to a jury to tell them that the claims are not valid. We always have to keep up with current literature. That usually involves delegating the task to somebody to consistently stay up to date. And obviously we haven't touched much on FDA compliance, but we need to be reporting and analyzing adverse events and determining whether we're getting some safety signals that we need to really look into. So with that, that concludes the presentation. I do want to just thank Courtney and Medmarc for having me, and I've put my email address here, so if you have any if you have any questions after this, I'm happy to attempt to field some questions, probably not too specific, but I do want to open the floor to any questions before we go, and so I'll hand it back to Courtney.
All right, thanks, Kyle. So we do have a couple. So we'll now begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your question in the space provided, hit the send button. Please make sure to direct your question to all panelists in that ask menu. So a couple that came in during the presentation. So Kyle, if there's technically a safer alternative design of my product, does that mean that any person injured by my product can automatically sue my company because I didn't employ that design?
That's a great question. So mostly in this presentation, we've talked really about duty and the standards of our duties, but what we didn't really touch on is that just because there may have been a safer alternative design, that some design might have been warranted, that doesn't mean that we are automatically liable, right? The plaintiff will still have to prove that the defect in the design, the specific defect of the facet of the design that the plaintiffs are pointing to, the plaintiffs are going to have to prove that that actually caused the plaintiff's injury, not just that the product in general caused the injury. And that's something that we will rely on heavily. We can't just have plaintiffs saying, well, there's a better way to design the product. Well, that only matters if you were actually injured by a design defect in this product.
Okay, along those same lines, does the plaintiff have to undertake any cost-benefit analysis? For instance, if a safer alternative would make the product much more expensive, is that still a viable argument on their part?
Yeah. I guess on the plaintiff's part, it would be more of a defense. But if it were reasonable to cost-wise to improve the product, then the plaintiff is going to use that evidence. On the flip side, if it's incredibly unreasonable and the cost of undertaking a complete redesign or something of that nature, then the defense is going to use it. And importantly, as we talked about earlier, that's a really tough leg to stand on for the defendants, because we don't want to be in the courtroom talking about how something is too expensive when on the other side of the counsel table is a plaintiff who was actually injured. Whether that was injured by our product or not, it's a tough position to be in. But that evidence of cost-benefit is actually important, yes.
Okay. So I know you kind of answered this, but overall, what good practices can my company keep to prevent and defend these design defect claims? Yeah.
So I think the last slide, we kind of touched on a little bit of this, but it's just incredibly important to exercise diligence. And that's sometimes hard, and as we talked about, it imposes cost, time, personnel, but it's important because of this huge duty that's imposed on medical device and pharmaceutical manufacturers. It's incredibly important that we constantly keep up. I can't overstate the value of continuing to review medical literature, continuing to review what's going on with my product on the market, and being very vigilant about what's happening on the market.
Thanks. And then we've got a question kind of more on the a warning defect question, but it comes, if a surgeon misuses the product, would the company be liable? I.e., we know the company can't possibly say every way not to use a tool or implant. So maybe, Kyle, you could touch on the foreseeability question.
Yeah, sure. So in some states, misuse of a product is a legitimate defense, and that's also going to touch, like Courtney said, on the foreseeability of the risk of harm. So that's a legal doctrine that tells us that we're not responsible for some outlandish risk that a doctor took because he misused the device. But if that misuse was foreseeable, if what he did was, we can think maybe some doctors, because of the design of our product and because of the way it has to be used, if that's foreseeable, then that is something that we may need to think about warning physicians about. It's probably not enough to warrant a complete design change because we're talking about misuse, not the proper use of our product. But generally, that's going to be, I can't give a definitive yes or no that we're going to be liable or we're not going to be liable, but it would be a great defense to say this is not how the product is supposed to be used, and in our instructions for use or in our label, we direct physicians how to properly use the device.
Perfect. Well, that's all the questions we had. Thank you so much for such a great presentation, Kyle. Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.